When the first frost touched the settler's garden and the green abundance of summer began to die back, a quiet urgency filled the homestead. The harvest had to be saved. For the long, cold, barren months ahead held nothing fresh, and a family's survival through winter depended entirely on what they could preserve. And so the settlers became masters of drying and storing the plants that would carry them through. Long before refrigerators and freezers, the settlers knew how to capture the goodness of the garden and hold it through the winter. They dried their herbs, their fruits, their beans, and their roots, hanging them from the rafters, laying them in the loft, packing them in the cellar, so that the flavor, the nourishment, and the old remedies of summer would last until spring. A well-stocked store of dried plants was a family's security against the cold. In the next half hour, I am going to show you 7 plants the settlers dried and preserved to last all winter long. How they preserved each one, what it gave the family through the cold months, and why it mattered so much. And number 5 is a plant you very likely have in your kitchen right now, that the settlers dried by the bushel to flavor the whole long winter. To a settler family, the work of preserving the harvest was the most important labor of the whole year. Everything depended on it. A poorly preserved store meant a hungry, bland, sickly winter, while a well-filled larder of dried plants meant food, flavor, and the old comforts through to spring. The settlers gave their finest skill and care to this work, drying and storing with knowledge earned over generations. A quick and honest word before we begin. Everything I share here is history and tradition, offered for curiosity and for the love of old fading knowledge. It is not medical advice. Some plants are potent, so never use any plant without proper knowledge. With that understood, let us step back in time. Welcome to the American Settler Garden, where we dig up the forgotten plant wisdom of America's pioneers. The families who captured the abundance of summer and held it through the winter with nothing but the sun, the air, and their own careful skill. To understand the settlers' winter, you have to understand that there was no other source of food and comfort but what they had saved. When the snow lay deep and the ground was frozen, nothing grew. There was no store, no fresh market, no way to get more. Everything the family ate, seasoned with, and turned to for the old remedies through those long months had to come from the harvest they had preserved. So the settlers learned the patient arts of preservation. They knew which herbs to hang and dry for flavor, and the old traditions, which beans and fruits to dry for food, which roots to store in the cool cellar. They knew how to cure each plant so it would keep, how to store it so it would not spoil, and how to draw on these stores through the winter. It was knowledge as precious as the food itself. Much of this wisdom came from the old country and from the native peoples who had preserved the harvest of this land for countless generations. Together it became the saving art of the settler home. And like so much of it, it faded when the freezer and the store arrived. Today we remember it, beginning with the first plant. And as we go, remember that this was not a hobby or a craft to the settlers, but the very work of survival. Every skill of drying and storing was learned because lives depended on it, refined over generations into a deep and practical mastery. There is a dignity and a seriousness in this knowledge that we, who can simply buy our winter food, can scarcely imagine. Number 1. Beans. The settlers prized the dried bean above almost all other stores for one simple reason. It would keep, season after season, without spoiling, holding its rich nourishment in the cool cellar until it was needed. A barrel of dried beans was a barrel of certainty against hunger, the surest foundation of the winter larder. Among all the plants the settlers preserved for winter, few were more precious than the humble bean, dried hard and stored away by the sackful. For the dried bean was a miracle of preservation, holding rich nourishment in a form that would keep almost indefinitely through the longest winter. Settler families grew beans in abundance and let them dry right on the vine, then shelled them and stored the hard-dried beans in sacks, jars, and barrels in the cool, dry cellar. There they would keep for a very long time, ready to be soaked and cooked into hearty, filling, nourishing meals all winter long. A barrel of dried beans was a barrel of security, packed with the protein and substance a family needed to survive the cold. The beauty of the dried bean was how completely and how long it kept, losing none of its nourishment as it waited in the cellar. The settlers knew that beans, more than almost any other crop, could be stored to carry a family through even the hardest winter. They grew and dried them by the bushel, the foundation of the winter larder, and there was a deep and sober truth behind all this careful work, one the settlers never forgot. The preserving of the harvest was, quite simply, the preserving of life itself through the winter. Every dried bean, every hung herb, every stored root was a small insurance against hunger and cold, and the family's survival was woven from the sum of all this patient, faithful labor. And the bean, of course, fed the soil as it grew and the family as it was stored, one of the most generous and essential of all the settler crops. To use them as the settlers did, dry beans fully on the vine and store them in a cool, dry place for the winter. The next plant was the fragrant herb hung to dry. Dried on the vine and stored in the cellar, the beans kept their rich nourishment through the longest winter, the surest foundation of the family's larder against the cold. Number 2. Sage. The settlers gathered sage in the warm months with special care, knowing that the bunches hung to dry then would still be giving rich flavor deep into the winter. Few herbs held their scent and savor so faithfully through the long cold months, and the settlers dried it in abundance for the heavy winter meals. Sage, that soft silvery herb with its warm earthy scent, was one of the settlers' most treasured herbs to dry for winter, for it held its flavor and its old traditional value beautifully when cured. A good store of dried sage meant seasoning and comfort through the cold months. Settler families gathered sage in the warm months and hung it in bunches to dry in the airy warmth of the kitchen or the loft. Once dried, it was crumbled and stored in jars, ready to flavor the heavy winter meals, the meats and stuffings and stews that sustained the family through the cold. Sage dried especially well, holding its strong scent and flavor long into the winter, and it was valued in the old traditions for the throat besides. Sage holds its aromatic oils well even when dried, which is why a bunch hung to cure in the late summer still gave rich flavor deep into the winter. The settlers prized it as one of the most reliable herbs to preserve, a faithful seasoning that lasted the whole cold season. They dried it in abundance for the winter table, and the settlers took a quiet pride in a well-filled larder that we can scarcely imagine today. To look upon a cellar stocked with beans and roots, a kitchen hung with drying herbs, and shelves of stored food was to look upon security and the reward of a year's hard work, a deep reassurance that the family would come through the winter well. And sage was a seasoning, a herb of the old health traditions, and a guardian of the home besides, one of the great all-purpose plants of the homestead. To use it as the settlers did, hang sage to dry in bunches and store it crumbled in jars for the winter. The next plant was the mint dried for winter tea. Hung to dry and stored crumbled in jars, the sage gave its warm, savory flavor to the heavy winter meals, a faithful seasoning that lasted the whole cold season. Number 3. Mint. The settlers treasured their dried mint as a saved touch of summer, a jar of brightness to open in the depths of the cold, dark months. A warm cup of mint tea, fragrant and soothing, was a small comfort and cheer in the bleak winter, and the settlers dried the mint in abundance for exactly that gift. Our faithful mint returns, for the settlers dried it carefully to enjoy its fresh flavor and its soothing comfort all through the winter, when no fresh green thing could be had. A store of dried mint was a touch of summer's freshness, saved for the cold, dark months. settler families gathered mint at its most fragrant and hung it to dry, then stored the dried leaves in jars to keep through the winter. All season long, they drew on this store to make warm, soothing mint tea, valued in the old traditions to settle the stomach and comfort the body, a cheering, fragrant drink in the depths of winter. Dried mint also flavored winter dishes and freshened the home when fresh was long gone. Mint holds its menthol oils and its fresh scent well when properly dried, so a jar of dried mint gave the bright taste of summer even in deep winter. The settlers valued it for this lasting freshness and comfort, drying it in abundance for the winter teas and remedies. It was summer's freshness, saved in a jar. And the saving of summer's freshness for the winter was one of the small triumphs of the settler home. In the bleakest depths of the cold, to open a jar of dried mint and breathe its summer scent, or to sip its tea, was to defeat the winter in a small way, to hold a piece of the warm green world through the frozen months. And mint, ever generous, freshened the home, guarded against pests, and comforted the family besides, one of the hardest working plants of all. To use it as the settlers did, dry mint at its most fragrant and store it in jars for winter tea. The next plant was the fruit dried for winter sweetness. Dried at its most fragrant and kept in jars, the mint gave the bright taste of summer in the winter teas, a saved freshness and comfort for the cold, dark months. Number 4. Apples. The settlers hung their strings of dried apple rings throughout the home, a visible store of sweetness and goodness for the winter to come. To eat a dried apple, or to cook them into a pie, was to taste the autumn orchard in the heart of winter, a treasured sweetness when no fresh fruit could be had. The apple, that beloved fruit of the homestead orchard, was one of the most treasured things the settlers dried for winter, for dried apples held the sweetness and goodness of the autumn harvest through the longest, coldest months. A string of dried apples was a winter treasure. Settler families gathered their apples in the fall and sliced them into rings, then dried them in the sun, by the fire, or in the warm air of the home, threading them on strings to hang from the rafters. Once dried, the apple rings kept for many months, and through the winter they were eaten as a sweet treat, soaked and cooked into pies and sauces, and added to countless dishes. Dried apples brought sweetness and fruit to the winter table, when no fresh fruit could be had. Drying concentrated the apple's sweetness and allowed it to keep for many months without spoiling, a simple and reliable way to preserve the orchard's bounty. The settlers dried apples by the bushel, hanging strings of them throughout the home, a store of sweetness and goodness for the whole winter. They were autumn's harvest, saved for the cold, and the strings of dried apples held a special joy for the children of the homestead, a sweet treat in a winter with little sweetness. To pull a dried apple ring from the string by the hearth was a simple pleasure that brightened the cold months, the saved sweetness of the autumn orchard shared through the long winter. And the apple gave its fruit fresh, dried, and pressed into cider besides, one of the most beloved and useful of all the homestead's gifts. To use them as the settlers did, slice apples into rings and dry them for a winter store of sweetness. And now we come to the one I promised you. Sliced into rings and dried on strings, the apples held the sweetness of the autumn orchard through the winter, a treasured store of goodness when no fresh fruit could be had. And now we reach number 5, the one I promised you, a plant you very likely have in your kitchen right now, that the settlers dried by the bushel to flavor the whole long winter. Number 5, thyme. The settlers considered thyme so essential to the winter kitchen that no larder was complete without a good store of it. A pinch of the dried herb gave deep, warm, savory flavor to the plain winter fare, lifting the heavy meals of the cold months, and the settlers dried it by the bunch for the season ahead. Thyme, that small-leaved, intensely fragrant herb, was one of the settlers' most essential herbs to dry for winter. For few seasonings, gave so much flavor to the heavy meals of the cold months. A good store of dried thyme was a cornerstone of the winter kitchen. Settler families gathered thyme and hung it in small bunches to dry, then stripped the tiny dried leaves and stored them in jars. Through the winter, dried thyme flavored the soups, stews, meats, and breads that sustained the family, adding its warm, savory fragrance to the plain winter fare. Thyme dried wonderfully, holding its powerful flavor for a very long time, and it was valued in the old traditions for the chest and breath besides. Thyme is rich in aromatic oils that hold remarkably well in drying, which is why even a pinch of dried thyme gave deep flavor to a winter dish. The settlers prized it as one of the most reliable and essential herbs to preserve, a faithful seasoning that lasted the whole season through. They dried it in abundance for the winter larder, and the settlers understood that flavor itself was a comfort worth preserving, not a mere luxury. The plain, heavy fare of winter was lifted and gladdened by a pinch of dried thyme or sage, and these saved seasonings made the difference between food merely eaten and food enjoyed, a small daily comfort through the hard months. And thyme was a beloved seasoning, a herb of the old health traditions, and a guardian of the stores besides, one of the great kitchen herbs of the homestead. To use it as the settlers did, dry thyme in bunches and store the leaves in jars for the winter. The next plant was the root stored deep in the cellar. Hung to dry and stored in jars, the thyme gave deep savory flavor to the winter fare, an essential cornerstone of the cold weather kitchen. Number 6. Horseradish and the root crops. The settlers filled their root cellars in the fall with the hardy roots that would keep fresh through the winter, a buried larder against the frozen ground above. Packed in sand and straw in the cool dark, the carrots, turnips, and pungent horseradish waited, ready to feed and flavor the family through the cold. While many plants were dried, the settlers preserved their hardy roots in another way, storing them whole and fresh in the cool, dark cellar, and chief among these was the pungent horseradish, along with carrots, turnips, and other roots that kept through the winter. The root cellar was a treasure house of winter food. Settler families dug their root crops in the fall and stored them carefully in the cool, dark, humid cellar, packed in sand or straw, where they would keep fresh for many months without spoiling. Carrots, turnips, beets, and the fiery horseradish all waited in the cellar, ready to be drawn upon through the winter. The horseradish in particular was valued for the powerful flavor it added to the plain winter food and for its place in the old health traditions. The cool, dark, steady conditions of the root cellar kept these hardy roots fresh and whole through the winter, a natural cold storage that needed no drying at all. The settlers knew exactly how to store each root to make it last, filling the cellar in the fall with the food that would see them through. It was a buried larder against the cold, and these roots gave hearty food, sharp flavor, and the old remedies through the winter, a vital store of nourishment when the ground above was frozen hard. To use them as the settlers did, store hardy roots in a cool, dark place packed in sand for the winter. The final plant was the seeds saved for flavor in spring. Stored in sand in the cool, dark cellar, the hardy roots kept fresh and whole through the winter, a buried larder of food and flavor against the frozen ground. Number 7. Dill and the seed herbs. The settlers saved their dried seeds with a double care, for they were both a seasoning for the winter and the very promise of the spring garden. To store a jar of seed was to hold the harvest just gathered and the garden yet to come, the flavor of the cold months and the hope of the warm ones, saved together. We close with dill and the seed-bearing herbs, for the settlers carefully dried and saved their seeds, both to flavor the winter food and to plant the next spring's garden. The saved seed was a link between the harvest just gathered and the garden yet to come. Settler families let their dill, caraway, coriander, and other seed herbs ripen and dry, then gathered the fragrant seeds and stored them in jars. Through the winter, these dried seeds flavored the family's food. The dill and caraway seasoning the breads, the pickles, the cabbage, and the hearty winter dishes. And crucially, the settlers saved the best seeds to plant in the spring, ensuring the garden would rise again. The seed was both a seasoning and a promise. Dried seeds keep their flavor and their life for a very long time, making them one of the easiest and most valuable things to preserve for both the table and the future garden. The settlers prized their saved seeds doubly for the winter flavor they gave and the spring planting they promised. They were the harvest and the hope saved together in a jar. And these seed herbs flavored the food, aided the old traditions, and carried the garden forward to spring besides, a fitting plant to end on, for they held the promise of the whole cycle beginning anew. To use them as the settlers did, dry and save your seed herbs for winter flavor and spring planting. Dried and saved in jars, the seeds gave their flavor to the winter food and their promise to the spring garden. The harvest and the hope held together. And in our own age of convenience, there is a quiet wisdom in remembering these old arts of preservation. The settlers knew how to take the abundance of the harvest and make it last, wasting nothing, securing the family against the lean times. To learn even a little of their patient skill is to reclaim a kind of self-reliance and security that we have largely traded away. So there you have it. 7 plants the settlers dried and preserved to last all winter long. Beans, the keeping foundation of the winter larder. Sage, the warm seasoning of the winter meals. Mint, the saved freshness of the winter teas. Apples, the dried sweetness of the autumn orchard. Thyme, the essential flavor of the cold months. The cellar roots, the buried larder against the frost. And the saved seeds, the flavor and the promise held together. Every one of them helped carry a settler family through the long, barren winter, holding the flavor, the nourishment, and the comfort of the garden until spring returned, with nothing but the sun, the air, the cellar, and careful skill. The settlers could not buy their way through the winter. They preserved it, saving the abundance of summer to feed and comfort the family through the cold. And these 7 are only part of the settler's art of preservation. As I dug into this, I found far more than I could fit into one video. The full art of saving the harvest the old way, all laid out in simple pages. I gathered it into a guide called The Settler's Guide to Preserving the Harvest. If you would like a copy to keep, the link is waiting for you down in the description below. And if you believe this old knowledge is worth keeping alive, worth passing on the way the settlers passed it on, then go ahead and subscribe. That is all it takes to see the next one, because the plants the settlers preserved did more than feed them through the winter. Many were turned to in the cold months for the old comforts and remedies of the home. Next, I want to show you the plants the settlers relied on to stay well through the hard winter. That story is playing right here. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I will see you in the next one.